Hello, everybody. We'll give everybody a couple minutes to get in and get all signed in and set up, and we'll get started. Okay. Let's think we get most people in. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is David Carrick. I'm the Associate Director for the WVU Industrial Extension, and this is the second of our four-part series on supply chain. I think most of you were with us last week, but just for those of you who weren't, we're doing this in partnership with Orchard Street Solutions as part of our supply chain optimization and intelligence program. With the industrial extension being part of NIST MEP's national network, we have colleagues in all 50 states and Puerto Rico who are working on a nationwide supply chain effort to uncover some ways to strengthen supply chain, educate some folks on some things you may not know, and also to try to help you strengthen your supply chain through a supplier scouting program where we can leverage those colleagues in our other states to help you find something that you're either struggling to find domestically or maybe have a sole source or a whole host of reasons. So if you have any questions about that, Tracy Straub will be sending out some information after the webinar. Please feel free to contact me and I can talk to you more about that. Again, today we have Adam Lowe, the owner of Orchard Street Solutions, with us. Orchard Street's a management operations and strategy consulting service located in Baltimore, Maryland. We won't hold that against him. He's a West Virginia boy. He earned an MBA from West Virginia University and has over 15 years of leadership experience in multiple industries, including manufacturing, hospitality, and the Marine Corps. Most recently, he worked with one of the world's chief defense contractors, managing several departments, including global supply chain cell operations, talent strategy, manufacturing, factory consumables, and outsourcing and material return group. Sounds like a lot of responsibility. Throughout his career, Adams' people-oriented, process-focused leadership approach has positioned him to be selected for multiple large-scale projects, including team building, stabilization, growth, development, strategic efforts. His process improvement strategies and sound logistical planning has led to many team organizations and lasting success. So with all that, I'm going to turn this over to Adam so he can impart some of his knowledge on us. Adam, take it away.
Thank you, Dave. I greatly appreciate it. And as you said, my body is in Maryland, but my heart is in West Virginia, and that's where it will always stay. So, those of you who are in the state, I'm sure you can relate to the love that we all have for those mountains, and I will never stop loving those mountains. So, thanks for the warm introduction, and thank you so much for giving the platform for me to come back to the state. As I mentioned in the first of the webinar series, and then even in last year's series, the main goal, one of my main goals in Orchard Tree is to be able to combine some of the knowledge that I've gained through different experiences I've had, and bring that back into the businesses in the state of West Virginia as a support system, a support person, ideations, whatever it takes to get folks what they need in order to really flourish in their roles and in their businesses and watch that economy skyrocket. So that's what I'm hoping to do today in the next iteration of the supply chain series that we're talking about, and it is supply chain for daily operations. So I will kind of advance forward here a little bit in the slide deck, and today is one of these ones that is not. It's not super common for my historic operations. So I actually have tons of notes today, which I don't normally do. So if you see me looking around, I'm not checking my emails. I'm checking my notes to make sure that I'm getting you the best information. The next two webinar within the series are very heavily focused on practical application and operations, how to make those connections from your supply chain group or person or people to your manufacturing operations, your business operations, and to create one cohesive, flowing organization. So that's really the goal of the whole series, but specifically as far as practicality is concerned, today and the next week are going to be hopefully very, very practical, the operations that you see, and maybe we'll spur some ideas. I in no way, shape, or form have recreated any wheels here. I've really just combined a lot of common knowledge and best practices and put it into hopefully some language that makes sense, or just even spur some ideas. So that's the goal for today as well. We'll do a quick review. We'll pinpoint some opportunities, planning, and execution, and then we'll get to the meat of today, which is the common pitfalls and solutions. that's the area I'll probably spend a lot more time on, and probably need to spend hours on, because that I think is the most practical application piece. So please be thinking of any questions that you may have. Write them down. Keep them in the back of your mind, and then I'll try to leave some time at the end to discuss some of your questions, your ideas, your thoughts, anything that you might have for me, or specific instances where you see some connection issues that you might have within your operation. So let me go forward here a little bit. So just a quick review. Last week we talked about the supply chain and operations strategy. The main point from last week is that supply chain weaves through all things. In the 101 that we did last year, we talked about how supply chain, a very wide view of supply chain. We talked about how it is kind of touches everything within a business operation environment. And we are all links on a massive supply chain that goes across the whole world in some way, or we very well could be a worldwide, on the worldwide supply chain. So what we're doing this year is we're kind of taking it in from that wide view to a narrower view, not the narrowest view necessarily, but a narrower view of your specific link within that supply chain. That is your operation. That is your business. That is whatever you're doing, from getting your supply into your company, utilizing that supply, adding value, and then pushing it out. So how do we create the external reach of supply chain proper, and integrate that very closely with your daily operation, which is maybe your manufacturing, your business operations, communications, all that good stuff that has to happen inside of your company in order to develop that product and push it out to your customers. So that's the view that we're kind of, that's a good boiling down point of what we talked about, the first iteration. Now we're going to go into that practical element of creating some of those handshakes between your operation and the different focus areas. So, oh yeah, this is going to, here we go. Put on your seatbelt, because it's going to go kind of quick. There's a lot of really fantastic points I'm hoping to portray here, and to give to you some really good deep thoughts, and maybe just make some connections for you. So here we go. The first element I want to talk about in pinpointing opportunities, planning, and execution is knowing your mission. This, again, all of my models you'll see in everything that I ever do come from kind of a strategic, systematic, process-oriented view of how operations should be run. In my opinion, the more defined, the more simplistic the operations are, the easier they are to convey, the less confusion you have, the easier to communicate. All of those things we know have to happen really well in order for an organization to move smoothly. Begin with a common view, a common theme, and a top level understanding of what are our overall goals, what is our mission, what is our vision as an overall company. Again, go back to this last year's supply chain session 101 if you need more information on that. I talked very heavily about alignment within an organization there. Talked about it last week, so please check that video out if you have any questions. But essentially what we're looking at is your overall why, or your mission as a company, ensuring that all departments within your company are in alignment to that goal, that top level view. And then also, we know within our own different groups, we have boundaries, we have focus areas. So supply chain, whether that be an extended kind of supply chain hat that you're wearing that might encompass both external supply chain, movement within your company, receiving and shipping. It might be warehousing. I'm not sure what hat you're going to be wearing if you're listening to this right now, or what you have within your operation, but there's some definition of what you would say would be your supply chain area, your supply chain department. It could be one or all of those things and even more. What this is to try to make sure that your mission within your supply chain operations fits the overall mission of the company, as well as the mission of your manufacturing group, your business operations group. What the entire group is working in a cohesive way. And again, I focus in very heavily in this session and always on simplicity, because we have such a natural tendency to get complex very quickly, and then that becomes very difficult when you're working in a matrixed environment of groups, in order to stay on the same page together. So there's a few key, we should always try things that I like to say. One of them was we should also always try to stay simplistic. Our messaging, stay simplistic. Our visions and our goals, keep them as simple as possible, so that anybody can pick it up, read it, and understand, with a pretty high degree of certainty that they understand what our mission or what our goal is. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean we can't do anything big? Does that mean we can't have any huge, lofty goals? No, not at all. But what it means is we need to break those down into as simple a form, a simple of goal as we can. So one of the things that I want to talk about a little bit is how do we do that? How do we set simplistic goals within our supply chain that dovetails in nicely with our operations group or our manufacturing business, what have you? So the first is to define. In my opinion, to define the goal in the spirit of the different groups that are involved. So define and interpret kind of fit pretty closely together. So that's why I've got those at the top. So defining it and then interpreting it in the language and in the concepts of that group. So the way we define something for manufacturing as a goal might sound a little different uh, in terms of outworking of language than what the words that we might use in a supply chain for the same goal. So how do we define the parameters and understand the language there, and then simplify that language down to where whether or not you're standing in a manufacturing floor, it means the same thing to you, that goal, as it would to someone in supply chain. Now, the outworking of that and the alignment, which is the next bullet, the alignment of that may very well be more defined language. So using those supply chain terms, contracts, in-house production time could be both, manufacturing and or supply chain. But those concepts that are defined within these key terms that we like to use when we get on the manufacturing floor or in the supply chain world, that's when you can define those in the alignment structure. One of the things that I like to use as a tool myself, I've seen some great success using this. It's what's called a RACI. A RACI tool, if you're not familiar, it's RASCI. It's just a way of defining the roles that are involved in a goal or a mission. So that might what department is within this overall goal. Supply chain being one of the departments, manufacturing being another department. So you find out within that structure of all the different groups who may touch a specific goal, what is their responsibility? What is who is responsible for it, who is accountable for it, for the A. The S is who supports it. C, RASCI, C is who is consulted within a decision or within this goal, perhaps. And then finally, I would be who's informed, who just needs to know about it, might not impact them that much, but they need to be on that list or that group of people who know about what you're doing. If you can define your goals within a RACI structure, you can define your mission or those parameters that you've created for your groups, especially like supply chain, knowing where their role begins and ends and all the things inside of those parameters. I always like to talk about it in terms of a fence, and I got this from my dad. I stole it from him. So Dad, if you're out there listening, I don't know that you are, but if you do, this one's for you. So thinking about where your fence line is. Dad's a rancher. He's got a little farm in West Virginia, and so he thinks of his fence line is like how you keep your things safe, how you keep your operation from bleeding out into the community, bleeding out into others, creating those redundancies and those overlaps and things. And the same thing is true with our organizations. Now we're always going to have those touch points. There's always gates within our fence, right? So we need to know where those gates are and who they touch. This is another good way of taking that RACI and determining, um, you know, who is responsible for opening and shutting those gates? Where do we work together? Who is accountable and for making sure that this goal, this whatever's done. So, I won't belabor the RACI in and of itself. Many of you, this might be old hat for everybody on the call, but if it's not, it's just a good way of framing out, how do you make sure that everyone's included who needs to be included in these decisions, these goals in your organization, and then how do we know how to keep these communications channels? So that's going to come in some later slides. We'll talk a little bit more about that, about potential downfalls, potential problems that could come up, and solutions for those problems. But that's just a framework for a system or a process that we can put in place that will help us to create that foundation and that alignment. Again, we talk about crafting messages and communications, going back to those gates, where are those gates? Who needs to be informed? Who do we need to be talking about with these different goals, and what language are we using? Again, simplistic language so that we both know what each other's talking about and we understand who owns what part of that. And then a constant review cycle. I can't preach that enough. A constant review cycle. We can't set up goals and things without any form of metric or wicket, or how do we determine whether or not this is being done? That's doomed for failure when we do that. So in a review, and then out of that review, not saying, well, it's not working as great as it can be, but it is what it is. Saying, okay, wait a minute, if it's not working that great, what's not working within our system? What's not working within our processes? And let's adjust it. Let's make those changes in order to adjust that system in a more positive way, and how we communicate between our different groups, whatever that might look like. These are the different kind of structures of how we can do. And then you loop it back around. You start back in with making sure the definition, the interpretation is correct, and making sure that people are communicating correctly all the way through. So that is kind of a basic framework of goal setting in general. And again, we're going to expand a little bit more into that goal setting, but I wanted to make sure that we had some touch points there, that we were all on the same page as far as like what goal setting might look like in a matrixed environment with multiple groups. And I think simplicity there is key. The next is our supply chain system architecture. So now we're going to kind of focus a little bit more on supply chain, generally speaking, within this group. Again, not forgetting that those gates are still there in the fence line, right? We need to make sure that we're looking for those touch points. Who are we communicating with? Taking that ratio and really understanding if we're doing something in supply chain, it is going to be impacting somebody else, very, very likely on the floor, in the business units, something, somewhere. If we're making decisions, don't make them in a vacuum. We need to go back to that ratio and say, oh, when I'm making this decision for this goal in my RACI, oh, I need to make sure that I'm telling manufacturing that I changed that date when their materials coming in, things like that. It just helps us to give that line of communication. So it's kind of the memory that we don't need to store up here, and it puts it onto a piece of paper so that somebody understands this is how we process things. This is how we do things. I won't belabor it anymore, even though I would like to spend an hour just on that. So number one, there's identify key supply chain focus areas, creates simple supply chain goals in alignment with company goals. Won't belabor this. A lot more to talk about this in the future, next week and on. But this is just it's making sure that our individual internal supply chain goals meet those overall company goals, so that we've framed it out in terms of supply chain. We've used that alignment. We've aligned ourselves to these company goals, but then those operations are going to be different than it would be in on the manufacturing floor within our supply chain operations. I mean, obviously, they don't have the same mission. They're not living in the same pasture, the same field that we are. We have things within our field that we have to make sure we do. What are those? I'll go a little bit more in depth in that here in just a second. But for now, it's just remembering to make sure that our internal supply chain structure and alignment aligns with company goals, and then also reaches out through those fence lines into those from where those gates are into the other areas, and ensure that we understand what their goals are and they understand what our goals are in the common language, a simplistic view, and an understanding that anybody would be able to come in and say, I get what you're doing here. I understand why you're doing that type of thing. Get it down to the base level. I can't, again, preach more about that. Excuse me. Setting achievable milestones. So I think we get really sometimes very lofty with our goals, and I love it. I love the idea of being able to change the world or boil the ocean. That is where my brain lives all the time. So this one is really as much preaching to myself as it is to anybody else. But setting achievable milestones, not reaching a little bit too far, but then also not undercutting yourself. If you know every year you've delivered 25 pieces of something, you shouldn't set a milestone at 10. I mean, that's not that's nothing, this is a dumb example, but, and it's also probably not wise to set it at 300, right? So, unless you're making major changes to your operation, which, hey, go for it. You know what? If you have a lofty goal like that, but you have a plan to get there, fantastic. But it's setting achievable milestones within your organization. And again, simplistic and aligning them with the overall company goals. And then third down here, it is recognize and name pain points and roadblocks. And so I specifically say name because in these communication efforts, again, those gates are open, you're chatting with manufacturing and you have a pain point. They very well could be the solution that you didn't know either A, was possible, or B, that they could do, within their scoping. So being open and honest with your communications channels and saying, hey, I'm having a real difficulty in supply chain getting vendor A to get this material in on time. We've come up with a million different ways and they just keep failing. And your manufacturing could be able to say, something to the effect of, well, why? Why are you trying to get that in so fast? Well, their delivery date is next week, and we, they're always a week late. And manufacturing might say, yeah, but that material sets on the shelf for 3 weeks until we actually need it. Oh, okay. So you're telling me I can give them some relief on their delivery dates? Well, sure. We don't use it until about, 3 or 4 weeks into the build process. Oh, okay. Again, creating those pain points and naming those pain points within your architecture, that's why creating those communication channels and those open gates is really important, because you never know what solutions might be out there. And this gets to the heart of what we were talking about earlier, is these connecting points and creating this mindset and this mentality that supply chain isn't outside of your daily operation. It's a part of your daily operation. It is in your daily operation. And this is the key. These are the types of things you can look at and see if you expand your mind, and don't just say, and I'm not saying anybody on the call does this, but I have seen it, let's say, outside of this wonderful group. Just a joke. I'm sure people maybe see this in your own operations, just something to think about. But how do we look at our operations and determine how to instill this mentality that supply chain isn't this stovepiped external, or getting our supply in, getting our vendors online with our mission, isn't a separate entity from what we're doing on our daily operations. Because guess what? If vendor A, that isn't a part of your company whatsoever, but has a product that you really need, if they're not getting it to you on time, that is impacting your daily operation, right? You're going to be sitting there waiting for it. Being able to communicate that and communicating those pain points helps to open up those solutions and give you more of an opportunity to get those solutions. So that's a bit of the supply chain architecture there, that can help with kind of make those connections within your daily operation. All right, and I've talked a lot about this already, and so I let the cat out of the bag a little bit too early. But my big framework in the way that my brain just naturally thinks, and the way that I've seen very large successes throughout my career, is when I've seen or been in environments that are very much systematic, systems focused, and then systems of systems. Now, I keep saying early on simplicity, and I did that on purpose, because when you get to a system of system architecture, it can get very complex very quickly. You start looking at those subsystems and subsystems of subsystems that all have to work in conjunction to make sure the overall top level system works naturally. And sometimes you have subsystems within the supply chain world. Sometimes those subsystems are within manufacturing or business. And getting those guys to talk nicely together can be very difficult. And the reason I go back to the simplicity is, if you have a simplistic subsystem as to the base level and it's able to be explained as simply as possible, then identifying your bottlenecks within that larger level system, that top level system, is a little bit easier. I won't say it's easy at all, because I know the complexity of our and design of our businesses, especially now, we've gotten so good at it. It does become very complex very quickly. So sometimes you don't really know which lever you pulled at some point that caused an outworking that wasn't great. I liken this back to as far as understanding your systems and levers and systems of systems and being able to drive back down, is putting things in place, again, going back to that first slide, that help you to review on a regular basis to ensure that your subsystems are in conjunction and working well. So that's kind of like a quality review type of a mentality. That's just a kind of a side note, and it does go into the alignment of groups and key personnel with high impact areas and creating parameters and expectations. There's a note of quality within that, and also checkpoints within that system. And so basically what that is just making sure within your system you understand. Again, we mentioned the key the key I'm sorry, pain points from the last slide. If you recognize that your system has key pain points, it's a good idea to utilize your resources. I won't go into super depth here because I do have a slide on this later, but identifying your resources that are most likely to help when they come across those pain points. That could be personnel. It could be manufacturing equipment. There's a number of different systems or solutions that you can put in place to address those key impact areas. So again, understanding your supply chain system and knowing those pain points and knowing those areas within your supply chain system, as well as your manufacturing operation, as well as your business operation, and saying, I know my key areas, and I know what's inside of my fence line. I know what I'm responsible for. I know what I'm doing. I also know my key pain points, and I know which ones are going to be it could be for manufacturer. Sorry, for supply chain. That could be a component. Understanding that a component that you bring into the company is extremely important to your manufacturing. It's extremely important to the product that you're building. It's very hard to get. It's only one supplier in the world has it, something like that. Well, that's elevated to one of those key focus areas for your supply chain group. And you can identify those key focus areas and make sure that you put extra loops of systems even redundant systems. All redundancy isn't bad. A lot of people say we need to streamline everything. We need to make everything remove redundancies. Well, that's good in some ways. Again, you don't want people, having their field come into your field and all that kind of stuff. However, sometimes redundancies are great. That's kind of the idea of the quality piece that I was speaking about there, to try to connect those two thoughts, is making these quality checks within your systems um, prevalent and repetitive, and so that you can start catching any of those redundancies or those pain points early on, and then you can point your key personnel and your system, your solutions in the right areas, and you're not kind of wasting the time of your key engineer, let's say, on building something that isn't as important to the overall solutions that you need for your product line, or whatever that might be, using your key personnel for supply chain working on a contract or working on a negotiation that isn't, wouldn't say worth their time, but it isn't as high level as another negotiation they can be. If you know your key pain points, you know those key areas to focus on, that's how you can realign your groups in your systems of systems framework to the correct areas and get the maximum amount of productivity from those higher level personnel or systems that you have in place. Finally, understanding touch points. Again, talked a lot about this one. Maximize efficiencies and minimize redundancies. I do think the vast majority of redundancies, even though it's kind of contradictory a little bit to what I just said, there is need for some redundancies, especially in terms of quality, but quality of your work, quality of your operation, quality of your systems and checks and balances and whatnot. However, when you start to think through these well-defined systems, well-defined parameters of what you're responsible for, going back to that racy, and understanding that you don't need perhaps to do X, Y, and Z, because you can rely on another team who's responsible for that within this overall goal that we have. That helps you to minimize and maximize your efficiencies, minimize your redundancies. And again, won't go into detail there because I've kind of elabored on that with the past few slides. So, but that's just a key reminder of how you can look at this RACI, or these alignments of your systems and your systems of systems, to make sure, again, you're keeping the bottom level as simplistic as possible, so that you can negotiate and travel up and down your system of systems and find those either redundancies in this case, or those key downfalls, those problems, whatever. The more simplistic it is at the bottom, maybe the easier to view and define once you get to those top level of systems of systems. So that's why I mentioned pretty heavily at the beginning how a focus on simplicity is really important at all levels. Again, you don't want to get to these systems of systems either, and have no way of really explaining how how the soup is made, essentially. Or you want to be able to be able to have those discussions with these different departments who might be within your matrixed environment, supply chain being one of them. You want to be able to go into your supply chain folks, if you're in manufacturing, and say, this is the reason that something that's happening within your scoping is having a negative impact on us. And here's why. And because I saw this in this system, and this thing isn't getting here on time, or that, being able to get to the bottom level, to that simplistic view, and explain that in terms that your supply chain person will understand. And then vice versa, saying, hey, here's why we're not getting our stuff in on time, and being able to get to that simplistic, here's how it should work and here's how it's not working type of a deal. And being able to explain it in a very simplistic way is very important in creating those relationships, those working relationships, and then weaving in that supply chain mentality through your whole factory. All right. So let's jump right in. I was going to say let's pause a bit, but I do know how much is left over here. So we got a lot to chat about, and hopefully this will be a section that we can chat about at the end. I'm going to try to leave some time. This is when it gets a little bit more rubber meets the road. Again, I moved from very top level to a little bit higher level, and the types of systems and all that kind of stuff. It's kind of a mid-level view of your operation. Now we're getting into the nitty-gritty to some degree about what common pitfalls and solutions look like within a supply chain environment that is working as a cohesive part of an overall operation, that overall link on that supply chain being your entire business. So in this section, we'll talk a little bit about overcomplicating processes, neglecting planning, communication, and then misallocating resources. I'll give some examples and chat through what that might look like within your organization. These three kind of bubbled up as some of the ones that I see the most or have dealt with the most, and really see a systems of systems thinking being in a very good tool. And again, that RACI tool being a very good tool for the outworking of how we can make our operations work a little bit more smoothly. One of the note that I'll make here is the comment on the right side of the screen. Proactively identifying challenges and planning strategically can ensure smoother execution, mitigate risks, and drive continuous improvement in operations. Again, I didn't recreate any wheels. This all of these, I'm sure, in every leadership lecture, in every leadership book, in every operations book you'll read. Um, and it's trying to figure out through a connective type of a way how they fit into your operation. I find is probably the most difficult. Again, it's kind of of course we would want this. Of course we want to plan strategically. Of course we want to get out in front of and mitigate risk and drive improvement. But it really is an action of specifically targeting and moving and acting and trying and developing ways to do this on and again, I keep preaching it, but a system of systems backbone. That's, the way that I think is the most strategic way, the most action oriented way, and the most documentable way, so that when we get into an operation, we don't have one of our key people do a fantastic, amazing job, and they're so good at whatever they do, and then they win the lottery and they walk away, and all of those systems and processes and tasks and things that they had maybe up here or on their fingertips walks out the door with them. A systems of systems operation with a very heavy focus on process documentation and a process orientation of how do we do the things that we do, and can I point to it on a piece of paper? Again, that's the mentality that I've kind of tried to bring to the forefront in the earlier stages of this, and then that goes into play, right now in these next few slides. So common pitfalls and solutions, overcomplicating processes. And I hope everybody out there is laughing along with me a little bit, because you too are thinking of a million different overcomplicated processes in your life and the things that you've seen in operations. This one is on its face is one of the most common, I think, that we see. Why are we doing all these different steps in order to just get this one outcome? Or, and I'm not even saying that a number of laborious steps aren't necessary. They very well could be. A complicated process in and of itself isn't the wrong thing, but overcomplication in the face of not really needing to be that complicated, especially with technological advances that we have today. For instance, I'll go back. One example that I have in my life is I went into an organization one time. I was tapped to start supporting an organization that historically not had a lot of love. It was kind of, keep on keeping on, and it was in the manufacturing group, and they had kind of had a specific tailoring operation where they moved material around basically and got things in and out of an area, and nobody had really touched it very long. But there was external groups that needed things to be moved, and they talked to this group and they asked them, well, when I came in, they were using, and this was just years ago, a few years ago, they were using a document, a Word document that they would have to open up. Anybody that needed something done would have to open it up. They would have to go through and type out exactly what they wanted to do in these different sections. And then they would have to print it off. And then they would have to attach it as a document because of the way that they wanted to print. It was unbelievable that we were like, why don't we just send an email, or why don't we just, use a Teams system for Microsoft that everybody has on their computer. It will document these things in a workflow simply, very easily. It's not that hard to do. Why are we still doing this whole thing? Well, it was because they had this laborious, overcomplicated process, and nobody really thought to say, wait a minute, we don't have to do that anymore. We're in a new world, or we have a computer now. We can we can use this computer for the maximum efficiency. And so what it was is just a bit of a mindset change in that specific situation, but it was such an overcomplicated process, and nobody had really tackled it, and it was great. Once we did it, it made it so much simpler, and everybody, it decreased the amount of time for, operations to get their things. It was fantastic, and it wasn't that difficult, but it started with the overcomplicated process. So jumping into the supply chain element here. So if you're in the supply chain role, or you work with someone in your supply chain role, this is going to be kind of a little bit more probably geared toward you at this point, but I will be talking about the touch points for the supply chain connection points with like operations and business and whatnot. So the first one we'll talk about is vendor management. So this is very much a hat that many supply chain folks wear. You have vendors who are sending you items, and you've got to manage these folks, these companies in a certain way. One of the pitfalls that I've seen, and as far as overcomplicating, is in the sourcing. So it could be constantly jumping from supplier to supplier is one way. Getting analysis paralysis, I like to say, and just analyzing every possible option until you don't have enough time to bring in the material to your operation, or only considering kind of cash or the money or the bottom line on its face and saying this source, it's the cheapest, we got to go with this one. It can really impact, in terms of overcomplication. For one, overcomplicating in terms of the analysis piece and just not making the decision that needs to be made. It doesn't need to be that overcomplicated. But again, getting into the systems thinking, do you have a way of defining these vendors in a simplistic way, um, or ranking, racking, and stacking the key focus areas that you need to have, in order to bring a vendor on board or to bring in a vendor, and don't go too far. Don't say that, oh, I need to labor over this a little bit more and think about this a little bit more. That does include, okay, overcomplicating, in terms of, in a way, this is a simplistic complication and not an overcomplication, but it is a complication, is saying that the only thing to really consider is how much money on its face a vendor is costing you. And what I mean by that is there are downstream impacts to your manufacturing operation potentially. If you're a supply chain person and you hadn't thought about this, there's downstream impact to your manufacturing operation that can happen because you picked the wrong vendor up front simply because they're the cheapest. Obviously, I'm sure it's probably coming to mind right now. It's the quality defect issue. That's just one, but there are other issues too. Delivery, is it killing your timeline because they're too slow? Things like that. You can really change how you figure out your vendors and your suppliers based on a simplistic process, of defining what it is you're looking at for a vendor. And again, I do understand that there are situations where there are very tailored vendors and only one in the world may be able to supply your product. Not really talking about this. I'm talking about more in terms of you have the option to go with multiple vendors type of a thing. Do you have a structure and a framework that you can go check by check and say, yep, I know exactly what I'm looking for. I know what's important to us as a company. I'm aligning my goal with the company goals. I'm creating a platform for me to be able to rack and stack my vendors. Here's what I go through. I check these things, and if they meet these criteria, let's go with them. Let's not overcomplicate it. Let's not think too much. And then in terms of communication as well, being able to not overcomplicate communication. Sometimes we complicate communication with our vendor, and the message gets lost in the sauce. What we actually need them to do, is much more simplistic than what it might sound like we need them to do. So, before you jump onto those communication calls with your vendor, think through what are the key elements that I need them to know so that they can help me get product out the back and I can make more money. Like, what are those key pieces that they need to know, whether it be, hey, we need this a little later, whatever that might look like, but boiling it down to the key, and then saying it. I mean, a technique you can use is to say, hey, I've got this really important, if you're in the seat of you're wearing that hat, I've got this, find somebody else, a manager, somebody, I got this important conversation I need to have with this vendor. Is this clear? Let me go run it by you real fast. Is this clear? And just creating that process internally for many different reasons. That's a good process. It helps you to get other viewpoints. It helps you to understand whether or not your communication is clear and concise and not overcomplicated. But it also gives you that relationship building with your manager and whatnot. But anyway, it opens up opportunities for that as well. Now I'm jumping onto the management side of my consulting, but I won't go into there. But that's, the types of techniques that you can instill in your workforce that will help you say, yeah, this communication's clear. It's not overcomplicated. They know, they're going to know exactly what we need from them, and we can deliver that message clearly. That will help in reducing that potential overcomplication of that process. Internal regulation. So this is lack of a process review and adjustment. And for the sake of time, I might run through this one a little bit quicker since I've already kind of beat up the process review and the quality aspect, or your constant checks and looping back and all that good stuff. But one of the things is just every now and then taking a beat. That's the main kind of thought here. And reviewing it. Review your processes, make sure things are still working. Look for those technological advancements. If you haven't reviewed a process in 15 years, it's probably time for a review. How can this get a little better? Taking that time, take a beat, look at it, review it, and then key is making those adjustments after you got that data back, right? Losing something, failing something, not getting something the right way, and then moving on as though nothing ever happened is just it's inviting that failure to come back. So if you're not making those adjustments when you do see those things, or if you're doing your reviews and you're failing at a test in a certain area, or you're dropping your vendors, you've identified a few vendors that are not meeting on the delivery dates on time, and then you say no, well, better luck next month. If you're not, do you have a higher level systematic structure of, well, this we're capturing this data. The vendor hasn't met delivery goals and dates in 6 months. What are you doing about it? Are you just going to continue to let that go? Or is it maybe it's not a big enough issue? That's fine. But have you thought through that and really reviewed it, thought through it, created the adjustments necessary? Either you allow or you don't allow. And then what does that process look like? Document that process. Okay, we got a vendor. Every 3 months, we're going to do a review. If they don't meet their deliveries for 3 months, then we start looking for second vendors, or we start reaching out to them if they're a key primary vendor, whatever that communication looks like. But having a dominoes that you can knock down rather than just saying, yeah, let it go. Don't overcomplicate it. Don't give it too many wickets to jump through. That's another, serious conversation. But having some sort of simplistic process that you can put in place to say, this is how we rack and stack. This is how we evaluate what we're doing. And then this is the remedy that we have when we need to make an adjustment. Okay. Oh boy, Tom. Okay. Material management. Overlapping orders, no MRP system, and then material receipt and shipping. Now we're probably starting to talk a little bit more in the language of some of you folks who work in manufacturing centric roles. So MRP systems might be familiar to you. Material receipt might start bleeding into some of that. Manufacturing part of the operation, depending on what hat you're wearing and the type of operation you run. Not everybody has their own receiving department and manufacturing department and global supply chain department. So I do understand that a lot of folks are going to be wearing a lot of the same hats, but overcomplicating processes is very simplistic in all of these. Overlapping orders that let's say with a vendor, you've got 10 different types of material, and maybe they're similar, maybe it's the same material, but you have 10 different purchase orders because of the way your business works. I mean, is there an opportunity to combine those? Is there an opportunity to take a beat, review your process, pull back and say, you know what? We always send 40 different purchase orders to the same vendor for the same part from maybe different parts of our world, different manufacturing parts of the facility, or maybe it's just out of necessity. Is there a way to take a beat, pull back a little bit, combine some orders that could punch your bottom line really, really hard too, because you might be able to say, oh, wait a minute, if we order 1,000 of these things rather than 100 at a time, 10 times, we can actually get a reduce, overall piece part cost. So if you're ordering 1,000, now granted, you have to determine if that works with your cash flows. But if you're ordering 1,000 at a time, maybe you reduce each piece part by 25 cents. That could be huge to your bottom line. Just looking for those overlapping orders and not overcomplicating, but simplify that process. No MRP system. This doesn't have to be a major, like go out and purchase SAP if you don't have it, or whatever your MRP preferential treatment might be. It could just be even mimicking an MRP system. How does an MRP system work? And it's material requirement planning. How do you determine what you need when you need it? And having some sort of a documented process and a system behind that, keeping it simple. Again, you don't need an overcomplicated SAP system necessarily, or whatever, MRP system you would be looking at. You might just need something that says, okay, I got an Excel sheet, and I would say the wise decision would be to make sure that you're pivoting with whatever technology you're using, and understanding like this could grow into something bigger. And how do we maybe preemptively create those connection points to the next type of machine or technology we would need, but thinking through things at that level. And then material receipt and shipping. For the sake of time, I won't go too in depth into that, but that can definitely be overcomplicated. Kind of on its face, you can see how that can get really complicated if you have a system of what all checks need to be done before things go out the door. Overcomplicating that can just slow that down. It can slow down your delivery times and whatnot. It may even make you miss delivery times if you aren't, simplifying your processes there. All right, let me move to the next. So the next one is neglecting communication. So this is a big one. I mean, I think in every area of our life, we can probably all point to the potential downfall in neglecting communication, whether that be at home or at work. So some of the focus areas here are between operations groups. So specifically, when you're talking about a RACI, who needs to know. This will be very helpful if you create that foundational level RACI. Again, it's at the top level, making sure that you have right systems in place in order to accommodate these bottom level issues that you're going to potentially see. So developing a need to know impact, that's kind of a long line with the RACI. Who needs to know about this? Who needs to be informed about this? If I'm making a decision, material's not coming in on time, I need to tell somebody in manufacturing if they're waiting on that material. That should just be part of your matrix. It should be part of your RACI. Um, again, it's that need to know, and then making sure that that communication channel is clean, clear, simplistic, and in the language of the person that you're communicating with. Invite internal visitors and or rotation. So this is a really an interesting one too, because a lot of the times we get stovepipe because we just haven't ever seen something before. So maybe your manufacturing group could be able to convey a lot more about how they operate and why they need certain things from the supply chain, the person or personnel group. If the supply chain simply went out on the floor and worked with them a little bit. So creating those opportunities to get one department hands-on working with another department so they can actually visualize what they're seeing can break down so many barriers. And it can help with that communication too. So again, using that language out there on the floor when you're a supply chain person, maybe you're not using that manufacturing common language. You can, if you're out there on the floor a little bit, you can start to say, oh, wait a minute, I know what you're talking about. I remember being out there. I can remember seeing your storage facility and remember seeing how you pull material and things like that. I understand why you need me to get this a little bit earlier. For instance, you pull kits to the manufacturing floor, you pull in material from your storage into the manufacturing floor, and it takes a really long time to get one piece because it's stored in a freezer, maybe, right? Well, if your supply chain person understands that it's stored in a freezer and it has to go through some maybe quality checks before it goes into a freezer or whatever that might look like, you can start to prepare that delivery date a little bit more in advance and say, well, right now we're saying it only needs to be delivered on this date, but I know that internal process, it's a little bit hidden because it's not quite normal. That internal process, because I've seen it and I know what it looks like, I can start communicating that out to my vendor and saying, hey, I need this really maybe 5 days in advance of when we said, just because our internal processes are a little bit, it's a little bit more laborious than the average piece. Little things like that can really help if you just get somebody out working, communicating, talking in the same environment. Vendor communication. So neglecting communication here. I mean, quite obvious why this could go wrong. So vendor assessment and relationship building. So if you neglect, and I'm okay again. I'll harken back to last week. So not every vendor is the same type of vendor. This, I'm really speaking to more of those vendor relationships that are almost hand in hand, that they need you and you need them, or you really, really need them. Maybe they don't need you as much, because maybe you order 10 pieces and of whatever, and they're used to selling 5,000 pieces at a time. So, maybe you're not their biggest customer type of a deal, but, making sure that you're understanding what that relationship looks like and you're communicating that appropriately. And you're saying, this doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? If you're neglecting those communications and you are the low man on their totem pole, let's say, maybe you don't get as much favor when you really need those 10 pieces to come in 5 days earlier, right? So if you're keeping up with that communication, you're making sure that they have what they need. Again, you're condensing it down to what really understanding what that person needs or what they need, and also what you need. And you could say, hey, listen, I know I'm not the biggest one, but man, this would be very helpful if we could do X, Y, and Z and whatever. If you have that relationship and you're able to build that type of a relationship with your vendor, whoever your contact is at the vendor, that's really really, really helpful long term to have those relationships. On the flip side of that, over and under communicating. So over communicating can reduce that relationship. It can kind of make it a little bit negative. Under communicating also, you're not telling them what you need, and then you get frustrated because they're not giving you what you need as the supply. And then you might get into this repetitive common cycle of all right, going back, we just need a new vendor. We don't need to go back to this vendor because maybe it's not necessarily their fault. Maybe that communication channel just wasn't as appropriate or as it could be. So again, setting a system in place and understanding what needs to be communicated at what level, how much, and all that good stuff prior to ever even reaching out and having that vendor on your roles is really important. And then having us align that with the goals of the company. What do we want to be seen as a certain type of company that just pitches vendors willy-nilly? And again, if it's cups, plates, and knives that you're buying for your break room, that's a little different because you can go out anywhere and get that. But if it's your key vendors and there's key areas, this deeper level of a communicative relationship is probably something to at least to look at and think about if you're wearing that global supply chain hat and that vendor relations hat. All right, next. And I do believe, Dave, time check. Are we 10 minutes out right now?
Sorry, couldn't find the audio button. Yeah, we're about 10 minutes left.
All right, fantastic. So I'll run through this one. I'll try to leave about 5 minutes left. So if you got those questions, start gathering those together because it's didn't leave as much time as I'd hoped. Misallocation of resources. This is the last one we'll talk about today. And this one's pretty basic in most avenues of approach. I'd say most folks have thought about this quite a bit as far as how you're utilizing your resources, whether that be personnel resources or materials or machines and whatnot. But over and under utilization in terms of management, being able to point things in the right direction, having a system on what is needed. I talked a lot about that at the beginning, how you point those resources in the right direction. Bottleneck hunting is a word that I like to use. Finding those bottlenecks, pointing your resources in the right direction. If you misallocate them, maybe your problems, problems don't get solved as quickly, things like that. For professionals, again, same. For your vendors, same. It's kind of the same thought process for each of the different levels here. So you're either, maybe you are misallocating your vendor resources in terms of, all right, what if you have a vendor who builds you 5 subcomponents? One of those subcomponents will basically sink your company if you don't get it in time. The other 4, good to have, right? Nice to have, but we can get them from multiple different vendors. Let's say that vendor is really struggling to get you key component A because they're trying to also deliver you key component B, C, D, and E. You can give them relief by saying, listen, let's work out a system here where we reallocate your focus, your resource in the right direction is going to help us. Like, we can give you some relief and, make it worth their while, whatever that looks like as far as communication goes, as far as money allocation and all that goes. If it's within the scope of your budget, if it's within the scope of your operation to do, giving them relief, helping them out, understanding why they're not delivering on time. It's part of that communication thing that I said, on the last one. Same thing here when you're communicating with your vendor, understanding what they're saying and why they're saying it, and then how can you allocate their internal resources well if you find yourself in that situation. I know a lot of folks do. They use a common vendor for many different products. Again, it's just something to look at if you're wearing your global supply chain hat. Is this vendor, and communicating that out with the manufacturing floor, the engineering team, whoever you work with in terms of how do you get things in and out, how do you move things around, determining those key pieces, determining those key vendors should be a part of that, and understanding that as your overall overarching goal as a company, as an organization. Here's our common goals. It's to get things in time. It's X, Y, and Z. These are the goals that we have as far as getting our material in. Very likely could be that vendor that you're managing is one of those key wickets, those key areas and those bottlenecks, because maybe we've overloaded them with subcomponents. Again, maybe what that looks like is, hey, until you can show that you're able to get us key component A in on time, we're going to have to go with, component E, and then maybe component D, and then C, and then B, until you show you've got this done. So we want you to be successful, but we have to get A in, and it has to be on time. That type of communication. You can be open and honest and frank sometimes, but you have to depend. It depends on your vendor relationship. Incoming material manufacturing schedule alignment. Oh boy, I could go Whew, I could go off on a tangent here, and I won't. We've got 2 minutes, or else I would. But so, how do you misallocate resources here? There's a plethora of ways for incoming material manufacturing and schedule alignment. But what I will say is, if the way a manufacturer, if you're wearing a manufacturing hat right now, the way that you can help your supply chain folks, and I'll talk a little bit more about this next week as well. So, but the way you can help your supply chain folks is by really understanding that in-house production time and then feeding them back that information to say, hey, it really takes us a long time when we're dealing with certain component. Um, in order to get our schedule alignment correct, we need you to get that as soon as you possibly can. That type of information coming off of the floor, if you don't have a really solid MRP or communication system that can automatically relay that to your supply chain person, that type of person to person information is huge. So if you know a piece of supply is really going to cause you issues on the floor, speak up, let them know. They can't do anything if they don't know anything about it, right? And you just can't always assume that they do, because it might be commonplace for you to know that out on the floor. But if they're not there with you every day, that's why, again, going back to the pasture, opening up that gate, chatting with them through that gate about, hey, this was causing us headaches. Can you help us out with it? And then saying, yeah, let me do what I can, that type of thing. Give them the tool to help yourself. That's part of that linking together and those communications channels that can be very, very helpful. Finally, operations support and alignment, sales, supply chain, and design and supply chain. Won't go into detail here, but misallocating resources in terms of sales would be something like pushing a product that is either very difficult to produce on time in general, and then almost overselling that and overtaxing your both your supply chain and your manufacturing facility. Thinking about that and what that looks like too. Just because there's a product that you sell doesn't mean necessarily that every product should be pushed as far as a sales position the same way, because it can put major strain on your supply chain by trying to force them to get all this supply subcomponent delivered very quickly in order to meet those sales goals. So just being able to communicate and understand that process. And then in design, same thing. Designing an element that is extremely difficult to either source, and you're not letting your supply chain know. Can we simplify that? And getting back to that simplification mindset, kind of full circle here. Can we redesign something to be a little bit more? Can the tolerances be a little bit wider? That might open up some opportunity for your supply chain person to source a little bit easier. Anything you can do and communicate in that way to help them, help you is really important. And with that, I will turn it back over. Like I said, we've got a few minutes. I was a little bit off on that. We got 4 minutes left. But Dave, if there are any questions that came in, be happy to answer those now.
Nothing's come in yet. We'll give everybody a second. Um, yeah, I really like what you said about making things overly difficult and looking for ways to maybe simplify them. Um, One of the things I've heard most in delivering continuous improvement services include we've always done it that way. And
Yeah.
I understand it works. There's a reason it worked, but it doesn't hurt to stop and take a look and see, is there a better way to do this now? Can we leverage some of the tools and the concepts you talked about? Maybe add some technology in there, or even just an easier way to keep it simple.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And it's just not being afraid of what the future could look like, and
Mhm.
having an opportunity mindset, and having a growth and, like you said, continuous improvement mindset, rather than a conservative, we just can't change because change might mean something different. Well, especially in the world we're living in now with change happening rapidly, having kind of a closed off mindset, can be very detrimental. I won't go any further than that, but it can be very detrimental. So I appreciate where you're coming from with that, and I do agree totally. Being able to have that a more open mindset and looking for that process improvement, and once it becomes part of your culture, by the way, and I'm sure you've seen this too. We could probably chat an hour about it or more. Once it becomes part of the mentality and you start to see the improvements, it becomes culture, and then you don't really see that desire to never change. It goes away pretty rapidly as once that snowball gets rolling down the hill.
Absolutely. You get over that first little hump everybody sees. We've noticed it most with our workplace organization offerings. You take that one area of the plant that's kind of dirty and beat up and you clean it up, and everybody else is like,
Yeah.
well, hey, I want mine to look like that.
Yep.
So you
Absolutely.
kind of take it, run with it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the hardest part of continuous improvement. It's just getting over the concept of change because the concepts, even the things you're talking about here, none of this is rocket science. And like you said, you're not reinventing the wheel. It's just having the time, resources, and drive to try to look for that change. So,
Absolutely. Absolutely.
yeah, you and I could talk for days about this. We have in the past.
Yeah, we have.
Um, it doesn't look like there's any questions there. So, if anybody has any last minute questions, feel free to throw them in the chat, or if not, we'll wrap up this segment, and we'll look forward to seeing everybody at the same time, same place next Thursday for the third installment of this session.
Yeah. Thanks. Thanks, everyone. Greatly appreciate the opportunity. Thank you, Dave and team.
Thank you, Adam. Have a good day, everybody.
All righty.